Early in the morning of February 4, 1986, like on many other days, Farmer Jack Carter woke up at dawn. The sun was just beginning its journey across the sky, painting the east with delicate stripes of pink and gold. With each step, Jack breathed in the fresh, still cool air, rejoicing in another day on his wheat field. But something seemed off this time. A barely perceptible unsettling shiver ran through him. Jack had always considered himself a strong and unflappable man. Over many years working the land, he had encountered numerous difficulties, but nothing could have prepared him for what he would discover that morning. As he walked between the rows of tall wheat stalks, something shiny on the ground suddenly caught his eye. He stopped and approached slowly. As he bent down to get a better look, his heart plunged into the abyss. What initially seemed like a strange bundle of clothes turned out to be the lifeless, disfigured body of a young woman. Jack froze, unable to believe his eyes. Soon, he noticed a gold ring on her finger, faintly illuminated by the first rays of sunlight. But that was the only thing left to suggest that this was once a person. The woman's face was so mangled that identification was impossible. Her clothes were torn, her skin covered in numerous bruises and cuts. The sight was so horrifying that Jack, a sturdy farmer, barely managed to stave off the rising nausea. With trembling hands, he reached for the mobile phone he carried in his pocket. Dialing the police number, he could not speak immediately, but eventually managed to say in a hoarse voice, "This is Jack Carter. I found a body. A woman's body in my field. You need to come right away." Detective Caroline Drake had served in the police force for over 10 years and had seen a lot during that time. But when she and her partner Michael Hunter arrived at the crime scene, even her seasoned experience was shaken by what she saw. "My God," she whispered, staring at the body. Michael, standing beside her, could only nod, unable to find words. Caroline circled the body, carefully examining every inch of the ground. There were no signs of a struggle, only broken wheat stalks and a few scraps of fabric clearly belonging to the victim. The face was almost completely destroyed, and even an experienced forensic expert would need time to identify this woman. "We need to find out who she is," Michael finally said, looking up at his partner. "That's the first priority." "Yes," Caroline nodded. "We need to interview nearby farmers and find out if anyone has seen anything suspicious." She already knew that this case would be long and complex. This was clearly not a typical murder. There was not just a death here, it was something far worse. She felt it with every fiber of her being. "Let's start with the farmers and then check all the local missing persons reports," she continued, trying to return to her usual train of thought. "We need to understand who this woman is and how she ended up here." Michael silently agreed. He knew this investigation would be a serious test for them. The evidence they gathered would mark the beginning of a long road toward the truth. And the truth, as they both understood, could be far darker than what they had seen here today. Thus began their work. Work that would lead them into the darkest corners of the human soul and leave a mark not only at the crime scene but also in their own lives. As the morning sun slowly rose above the horizon, detectives Caroline Drake and Michael Hunter continued their work at the crime scene. Against the backdrop of the harsh Australian landscape, their focused faces looked especially grim. The victim's body was already being prepared for transport to the morgue, but before that, Caroline, as always, made sure nothing was overlooked. "Caroline, take a look at this," Michael called, pointing to a gold ring on the victim's finger. Caroline leaned in closer to examine the jewelry. A simple but elegant wedding ring with a fine engraving inside. "To my forever," she read aloud. "This ring might help us identify the victim more quickly." "Do you think she was married?" Michael asked, noting the important information in his notebook. "It seems so. Or at least she was at some point. We'll need to check recent divorces in the area. It might give us a lead." As the detectives exchanged thoughts, forensic experts arrived at the crime scene. Among them was Jane Miller, an experienced forensic pathologist who had worked with Caroline and Michael for years. "This doesn't appear to be just a random killing," Jane said, studying the body. "There is too much violence, too much rage. I think the killer knew the victim and wanted her to suffer." "We need to identify her as soon as possible," Caroline replied. "It might help us understand who could wish her such a brutal death." Jane nodded and, after finishing her preliminary work, headed to the ambulance to accompany the body to the morgue. Meanwhile, Caroline and Michael returned to the police station to start the main part of the investigation. Their first task was to review all recent missing persons reports. They knew time was against them. With each passing hour, the trail grew colder, and the chances of finding the killer decreased. "Look at this," Caroline said, flipping through the files on her desk. "There's a missing persons report filed yesterday morning. Anita Lorraine Cobbi, 26 years old. Her parents reported her missing when she didn't return home after her evening shift at the hospital." Michael stopped and looked at the photograph attached to the file. A young woman with long brown hair and a bright, cheerful smile. She was wearing a nurse's uniform. "Fits the description," noted Michael. "But could such a sweet girl have made enemies?" "We need to find out," Caroline replied. "We should head to her parents' house immediately. They might help us with identification and provide more information about her life. Perhaps someone among her acquaintances had a motive." They quickly gathered their things and headed to the address listed in the report. Anita's home was in a quiet suburb of Sydney, typical of the middle class. Everything here looked peaceful and cozy, as if tragedies had never occurred in this area. When the detectives knocked on the door, it was answered by an elderly woman with a weary face. It was Mary Cobbi, Anita's mother. "Mrs. Cobbi, we are detectives Drake and Hunter," Caroline introduced herself. "We are investigating your daughter's disappearance." "Anita." The woman struggled to hold back her tears. "Have you found her?" Caroline and Michael exchanged glances. The silence in the room became deafening, and the air was thick with anxiety. "Mrs. Cobbi, we have found the body of a young woman," Caroline began gently. "We can't be sure yet, but we need you to help us with identification." Mary turned pale, her legs giving way, and she sank heavily into a chair. Her husband, George Cobbi, immediately came to her side and supported her. "We'll do everything we can to help you," George said, squeezing his wife's hand. "But please, tell us it's not our Anita." Caroline couldn't give them false hope. She pulled out a photograph of the wedding ring from her folder and handed it to Mary. "Is this ring your daughter's?" she asked. Mary took the photograph and, looking at the image, burst into tears. George immediately embraced her, his face contorted with pain. "Yes, it's her ring," Mary choked out through her tears. "I remember how she chose it. Oh God, why?" Caroline sighed heavily, seeing the grief enveloping these people. She knew the next few hours would be the hardest, but they needed to gather as much information as possible to understand who could have committed this terrible act. "Mr. and Mrs. Cobbi," she began softly, "we need to learn more about the last days of your daughter's life. About her work, her friends. Perhaps she mentioned something strange or unusual recently." George helped his wife up and led her to the living room, inviting the detectives to follow. It was the beginning of a long conversation in which they would uncover all the secrets surrounding Anita Lorraine Cobbi's life to find those responsible for her death. Surrounded by photographs of her daughter and memories of happier times, Mary Cobbi sat on the edge of the sofa, holding her husband's hand. The room was filled with a heavy silence, interrupted only by the ticking of an old clock on the wall. Caroline and Michael sat opposite them, preparing to hear a story that might shed light on the last hours of Anita's life. "She was a wonderful girl," Mary began, not taking her eyes off the photograph of Anita on the table beside her. "The doctors at the hospital simply adored her. They said she had a way of bringing light even to the darkest moments of her patients' lives. Yesterday, when she didn't come home," George frowned as he recalled the details. "It was unusual. Anita always called or let us know if she was going to be late. But this time, nothing. We started to worry late at night, but decided to wait until morning. I regret not starting to look for her right away." Caroline nodded sympathetically, understanding that the guilt tormenting the father was a common reaction in such situations. "Do you know what she was doing the night before?" she asked, trying to steer the conversation in the right direction. "Yes," Mary swallowed hard, trying to calm herself. "She was meeting a friend, Alice Walker. They often had dinner together after work. Then Anita was supposed to catch a train and go home." "Was Alice a close friend?" Michael asked, making notes. "Yes, they had been friends since college. Alice knew about Anita's divorce and supported her a lot. I think they were discussing her new life and future plans yesterday." "What can you tell us about Anita's divorce?" Caroline continued, trying to be delicate. Mary looked at George, as if seeking his support, then replied. "She divorced Stephen about 6 months ago. It was a difficult decision, but Anita thought it would be better for both of them. He was a good man, but their relationship started to fade. The divorce was relatively amicable. Stephen didn't harm her, as far as I know. Caroline exchanged a glance with Michael, pondering whether the divorce might have been a motive for the crime. So far, Stephen Davis seemed an unlikely suspect, but checking his alibi was worth pursuing. Do you know how their meeting with Alice went? Did Anita mention anything strange or unusual that happened that evening? Caroline asked. Mary furrowed her brow, recalling a recent conversation with her daughter. She said she had felt like someone was watching her for the past few weeks. It worried her, but she tried not to pay too much attention to it. Anita thought it was just her imagination after all the stress with the divorce and new job. Michael tensed. Did she describe anything specific? Maybe she mentioned any details? No, unfortunately, Mary sighed. She said she sometimes noticed someone staring at her in a crowd. But when she turned around, no one was there. Caroline felt a mosaic of facts coming together in her mind. The feeling of being watched that Anita had experienced might have been real, and this person might have been stalking her deliberately. Perhaps they were waiting for the right moment to strike. We'll need to speak with Alice, Michael concluded. She might remember something important. Caroline agreed, already formulating a plan. She knew that as Anita's best friend, Alice might have seen and heard things others hadn't. It was in this meeting that the key to understanding what happened to Anita might lie. Mr. and Mrs. Cobbi, we will do everything possible to find those who harmed your daughter, Caroline said, rising from the sofa. We will keep you updated on all our findings. If you remember anything else, please let us know immediately. Thank you, detectives, George replied, hugging his wife tightly. Please, find out who did this. We will do everything we can, Caroline assured him. And then, with Michael, headed towards the exit. They knew the next steps would be critically important. They had to find out who had been watching Anita in the weeks leading up to her death and how this person was connected to her murder. Soon, they were by their car, exchanging thoughts. Alice is our next step, Caroline said, getting into the car. We need to find out what they discussed that evening and if Alice was aware of anything Anita might have been hiding from her parents. Agreed. Also, I want to learn more about the divorce. Even if Stephen seems unlikely to be involved, he might have noticed something important, Michael added, starting the engine. They headed towards Alice's home, ready to uncover new details in this grim story. But even now, Caroline felt that behind the facade of peaceful lives, dark secrets were beginning to unfold. Caroline and Michael arrived at Alice Walker's house, located in one of Sydney's more modern neighborhoods. The pleasant facade and well-kept garden created an impression of coziness and tranquility. However, in light of recent events, this apparent idol seemed like a flimsy mask hiding the darkness within. They rang the doorbell, and soon Alice answered. The young woman, with anxious eyes and disheveled hair, looked shaken, as though she had been forced to face the worst news. Hello, Caroline said, introducing herself. We're detectives Drake and Hunter. We're investigating the murder of your friend, Anita Cobbi. May we speak with you? Alice hesitated for a moment, then nodded and led them into the house. Inside, it was clean and tidy, but the atmosphere was tense. She invited the detectives to sit in the living room, which was furnished with armchairs and a sofa adorned with soft cushions. Please, Alice said, pointing to the sofa. Have a seat. What would you like to know? Caroline and Michael sat across from her. Caroline began. We'd like to know about the last evening you spent with Anita. Can you tell us how your evening went and what you discussed? Alice sighed and rubbed her forehead, as if trying to gather her thoughts. We met at a restaurant around 7 in the evening, she began. We chatted as usual. Anita was a bit tense, but overall everything was fine. We talked about her plans for the future and her recent divorce. She said she felt lonely but was trying to move forward. Did she mention feeling watched or anything like that? Caroline asked. Alice paused, contemplating her words. Yes, she finally said. Anita did talk about feeling like someone was following her. She was worried about it but couldn't explain why she felt that way. I thought it was just stress from the divorce. How did she look that evening? Caroline continued. Was she particularly anxious or scared? No, Alice replied. She was tense, but not more than usual. Nothing out of the ordinary. We didn't discuss it much. Anita just mentioned that she didn't like feeling watched, and it bothered her. Michael made a note in his notebook and asked the next question. When you parted ways, did she mention where she was going or what she planned to do? Yes, Alice answered. She was planning to catch a train at 9 in the evening to go home. She always took that train to get home. There was nothing unusual about it. Did you see anyone suspicious at the restaurant or the train station? Michael asked. Alice shook her head. No, she said. Everything was calm at the restaurant. I didn't notice anyone strange. The station was normal too. Except she was a bit late for the train. But that didn't mean anything. We didn't discuss anything suspicious. Caroline continued. Would it strike you as odd if someone among her acquaintances or colleagues mentioned anything about her state or fears? Alice thought for a moment. I can't say, she said after a pause. I'll talk to Anita's colleagues. Perhaps someone noticed something unusual. But overall, Anita didn't share her worries with others. Her job was tough, and she often kept her feelings to herself. Caroline noticed the tension in the room increasing. Alice was clearly distressed and deeply affected by the loss of her friend. If you remember anything else or get any information that might help us, please let us know as soon as possible, Caroline said. We will keep you informed. Alice nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. I'll try, she said, her voice trembling. Please find out who did this. Anita was a good person, and she didn't deserve this. The detectives stood up and thanked Alice for her time. They knew they had a lot of work ahead, and each piece of information could be a crucial part of the puzzle. As they left the house, Caroline and Michael discussed the information they had gathered. Alice didn't mention anything that directly points to a suspect, Michael noted. But her mention of Anita feeling watched is significant. We might be dealing with a serial offender or someone who had been observing her for some time. I agree, Caroline replied. We need to follow up with her work colleagues and find out more about what might have been happening in her life. And of course, we should continue looking for witnesses or any information that could confirm or refute the surveillance theory. They headed back to the police station, where they would need to analyze the information they had and plan the next steps in the investigation. With each new piece of information, they moved closer to uncovering what really happened to Anita and who was responsible for her death. In the days following Detectives Caroline Drake and Michael Hunter's visit to the Cobbi home, public interest in the case of Anita Lorraine Cobbi's disappearance and murder remained high. New articles were constantly appearing in the press, and social media was abuzz with discussions of the grisly details of the crime and expressions of solidarity with the victim's family. The police were working diligently to uncover every possible lead, but time was running short. Caroline and Michael continued their investigation, with one of the crucial steps being the examination of Anita's last evening. They knew that anyone who could recall something significant might hold the key to solving the case. One of the first steps involved visiting the train station where Anita was supposed to board. The detectives wanted to understand who and what might have happened on the evening she disappeared. The station was busy, and the staff seemed to have remembered every passenger. Caroline and Michael spoke with employees who might recall Anita or any suspicious activity from that evening. We need to find out if there are any surveillance camera recordings or any evidence of what happened at the station on February 3rd. Caroline said, showing her badge. One of the station employees, Jonathan Smith, recalled seeing Anita on the platform that evening. He mentioned that she appeared distressed and looked around several times, as if searching for someone. I noticed she stood on the platform longer than usual, Jonathan said. And then, when the train arrived, she seemed to look toward the street before boarding the car. I thought maybe she was waiting for someone. This account confirmed that Anita might have sensed danger. Jonathan's testimony became a crucial piece of the puzzle, and the detectives continued their search. Next, they headed to the restaurant where Anita had dinner with her friend Alice Walker. They hoped Alice might provide additional insights into what happened that evening and anything she might have noticed. The restaurant was cozy and calm despite the grim circumstances surrounding the case. Alice, when called, looked confused and distressed. She was willing to cooperate but clearly under serious emotional strain. Alice, thank you for agreeing to meet with us, Caroline began as she and Michael sat at the table. We need to understand what happened that evening. Alice sighed and began to speak. Anita and I often had dinner here after work. That evening, we sat and talked about her divorce and her new plans. Anita was upset but couldn't decide how to move forward. She talked about how difficult it was for her to accept the changes. Did you notice anything unusual? Perhaps someone watching her or anything else? Michael asked, taking notes. No, nothing like that, Alice replied, rubbing her forehead. But when she left, she looked worried. I thought it was due to her personal issues. She mentioned feeling uneasy walking at night. Did Anita say anything specific about this feeling of unease? Caroline continued. I don't remember anything specific, Alice said. She mentioned lately feeling like someone was following her, but she wasn't sure if it was something to take seriously. Caroline and Michael exchanged glances. These words further confirmed that Anita was concerned and might have been the target of deliberate stalking. When Alice was unable to provide more information, the detectives thanked her for her cooperation and left the restaurant. Caroline's thoughts returned to the idea that Anita felt followed, and her feelings that evening might have been real. The next step was to return to the Cobbi home to gather more information about Anita's divorce and her ex-husband. Stephen Davis. Stephen seemed an unlikely suspect, but verifying his alibi and uncovering potential conflicts were crucial for the investigation. George Cobbi met them in the hallway, and they once again requested information about Stephen. We've reviewed all the details that could help with the case, Caroline explained. We've spoken with Alice and the station staff. Now we need to know more about your son-in-law. Stephen Davis might have some details that could help us understand what happened. George nodded and began to talk about Stephen. He confirmed that the divorce was amicable and without conflict, but noted that Stephen had been traveling frequently for work in recent weeks, and his schedule was quite busy. We'll check his alibi, Michael assured him. But if you come across any additional information or remember anything, please let us know. George promised to keep them informed and thanked the detectives for their work. As Caroline and Michael left the Cobbi home, they understood that there were still many gaps in the investigation and crucial evidence was still missing. Time was running out, and the investigators knew that every hour could be decisive in uncovering the truth. There was still much work to be done to piece together the final hours of Anita's life and understand who could have caused her such a brutal death. Anita Lorraine Cobbi's body was brought to the morgue, and the forensic examination soon provided key data that could shed light on her murder. For detectives Caroline Drake and Michael Hunter, working in the morgue became an important stage in the investigation, as it might yield additional evidence. The forensic pathologist, Dr. Jane Miller, met them at the entrance to the autopsy room. She appeared focused and tired, which was not surprising after long hours of work. Nonetheless, she was ready to provide the detectives with all the necessary information. What are the results of the autopsy? Caroline asked as she approached the examination table. Anita was brutally beaten and strangled, Jane began, reviewing her notes. Death occurred approximately 4 hours after she was abducted. We found evidence of strangulation and multiple injuries, which appear to have been inflicted during a struggle. Are there any additional pieces of evidence we should consider? Michael asked. Yes, Jane confirmed. We found DNA traces on her body that clearly do not belong to Anita. These traces were found on her clothing and under her nails. We've sent samples to the lab for more detailed analysis, but that's all we know for now. Caroline and Michael exchanged looks. The presence of foreign DNA suggested that the killer, or possibly multiple killers, was close to the victim during the attack. This opened up a new range of possibilities for the investigation. We'll await the DNA analysis results, Caroline said. There might be matches that could help us find the perpetrator. Also, Jane continued, we have another observation. The toxicology report shows traces of a powerful sedative in Anita's blood. This might indicate that she was coerced into cooperation or immobilized before the attack. Michael grimaced at this news. It meant that the perpetrator or perpetrators might have prepared for the attack in advance, and the victim was possibly completely defenseless. We'll check all local cases with similar traces, Michael suggested. This might help us find some connection. Good, we'll start with that. Caroline nodded. Meanwhile, we need to focus on suspects. We'll continue to review those who might have had a motive. The detectives left the morgue and headed back to the station to analyze the collected evidence and continue the investigation. The results of the autopsy opened new directions for their work, and Caroline felt they were on the right track, even though they didn't yet have precise answers. We need to find out whose DNA was found on the body as quickly as possible, Caroline said as they returned to the police station. This could be the key to solving the case. And let's not forget the toxicology report, Michael added. We might be able to trace the source of the sedative and find out who used it. When they arrived at the station, Caroline and Michael immersed themselves in reviewing all recent cases and uncovering potential connections. They knew that time was against them, and every hour they lost could bring them closer to missing crucial evidence. Soon, they focused on checking messages Anita received before her death and discovered that one of them came from an unknown sender threatening her. This message added another mystery to their investigation and raised a new question: who was this person, and how were they connected to Anita's murder? The next step for Caroline and Michael was to examine all of Anita's acquaintances and investigate possible connections between her professional and personal life. They knew that every detail could be important, and each new piece of evidence brought them closer to solving this horrific crime. Detectives Caroline Drake and Michael Hunter knew that every moment mattered, and their investigation was already filled with questions needing answers. While they awaited results from the forensic tests on Anita Lorraine Cobbi's case, they had to focus on another crucial aspect: examining other attacks on women in the same area. Their attention was drawn to several cases that bore similarities to Anita's murder. These attacks occurred in recent months, and although the victims survived, they described very similar signs of violence and aggression. The police had been unable to find clear connections between these cases, but the detectives were determined to find out if they could be linked to Anita's case. At the precinct, Caroline and Michael began to create a timeline of these attacks. On the table before them were photographs, reports, and case files that they examined carefully. Michael flipped through the pages while Caroline noted important details in her notebook. "Look here," Michael pointed to one of the reports. In this case, the attacker used a similar method of violence as in Anita's case. The attack also involved some kind of choking device, and the victim had difficulty breathing afterward. "Yes, I see that," Caroline confirmed. "These details might indicate that the attacker has a certain modus operandi. We need to check if we have any matches in suspect descriptions." The next step was to analyze all the attacks in terms of time and place. The detectives discovered that the attacks occurred within a few kilometers of the area where Anita was found, and in most cases, the attacker acted at night. "This could suggest that we have the same attacker," noted Caroline. "He selects victims in the same area and follows a similar pattern. We need to learn more about the other victims and see if there are any common traits." They also decided to conduct additional interviews with the victims of these attacks. Larissa Brown, one of the victims, agreed to meet with the detectives. She was a middle-aged woman who had survived an attack while walking home late at night. Larissa appeared visibly shaken but agreed to share her story. "He was so aggressive," Larissa recalled, sitting across from the detectives. "I couldn't see his face well, but he was wearing dark clothing and used something like a rope to choke me. I tried to fight back, but he was too strong." "Did you see which direction he went?" Michael asked, taking notes. "No, he disappeared into the darkness, and I was too frightened to pay attention to details," Larissa replied. "But there was something particular about his manner of attacking. I felt like it wasn't random." Caroline noted that Larissa's fear and stress were evident, but her description added important details. The specifics of the clothing and attack style could be useful for profiling the perpetrator. "We'll continue to look for the attacker," Caroline assured her. "If you remember anything else, please let us know." With those words, the detectives left Larissa's apartment and continued their investigation. They began searching for connections between the attack cases to see if they could create a psychological profile of the perpetrator. At the same time, they checked for any matches with known criminals to see if there was anyone who might fit their description. "If this is the same person," Michael mused, "we need to understand his motives and how he chooses his victims. Maybe he looks for certain traits in his victims. And we need to approach this systematically," added Caroline. "We should work on creating a profile of the perpetrator to focus our efforts on those who are most likely involved." In the next phase, Caroline and Michael decided to use the information about the attacks to conduct a wide-scale investigation and check all possible connections. They went to the area where most of the attacks had occurred and began gathering information from local residents to identify any suspicious activities or events. With each new testimony and piece of evidence, the detectives felt they were getting closer to solving the case. They knew the investigation would be complex and multifaceted, but they understood that every revealed link could bring them closer to the truth. They continued working through the difficulties and assembling the pieces of the puzzle to find the perpetrator who might be responsible for both Anita's murder and a series of other attacks. And although many challenges lay ahead, the detectives were determined to see the case through to the end and find justice for the victims. After detectives Caroline Drake and Michael Hunter reviewed the latest data on similar attacks on women in the area, they decided that the next step was to interview Anita Cobbi's ex-husband, Stephen Davis. There were several potential motives related to Anita's divorce and her previous relationships. Given that suspicions of a possible connection to her death had become more plausible, the detectives focused on determining his role. They arrived at Stephen's house in the evening. The rain, which had been falling all day, lightly drummed on the roofs and pavement, creating a gloomy atmosphere. Stephen greeted the detectives with visible anxiety but invited them in. "Good evening, Stephen," Caroline began as they settled in the living room. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about your ex-wife, Anita Cobbi." Stephen nodded, nervously awaiting the questions. "Of course. What do you need to know?" he asked, trying to appear calm. "We'd like to know where you were on the night of February 3rd, Caroline continued. "You're aware that Anita went missing that night?" Stephen tensed slightly. "That night I was at home," he said. "I watched TV for a while and then went to bed. I have receipts from the supermarket that will confirm I was out shopping late and then spent time at home." Caroline noted his statement but remained cautious. "We also heard that your divorce from Anita was quite difficult. Could this have affected you in any way? Were there any conflicts that might have led to something like this?" Stephen grimaced and sighed. "Our relationship was complicated, but I can't imagine harming her. We tried to maintain amicable relations after the divorce. I was disappointed that her life went downhill after our separation, but I didn't know of any threats or issues." Caroline and Michael exchanged glances. Although Stephen's alibi seemed plausible, they couldn't completely rule him out as a suspect. "We will conduct further verification of your alibi and, if necessary, come back with additional questions," Caroline said. Stephen nodded and escorted the detectives to the door. His nerves were on edge, and he appeared very distressed. When detectives Caroline Drake and Michael Hunter returned to the precinct after interviewing Stephen Davis, their attention was drawn to the news that Lisa Martin, a young woman who had seen Anita being pushed into a car, had come to the police with additional testimony. This could be a significant lead that might shed light on that night. Lisa arrived at the precinct in the middle of the day. Her face was pale and worn. She seemed worried that her testimony might not be helpful, but the detectives tried to reassure her. "Lisa, thank you for coming," Caroline said, trying to express her gratitude. "We want to understand more about what you saw. Please tell us everything you remember." Lisa closed her eyes for a moment, trying to gather her thoughts. Her voice trembled slightly as she began to speak. "It happened at the train station. I was waiting for my train when I saw a woman, Anita, being roughly pushed into a car. It was a silver BMW with dark-tinted windows. I remember that the car looked new and sporty." She paused as if recalling details. "I was afraid to intervene, but I remember how the man driving looked. He was large, in dark clothing, and I couldn't make out his face." Michael leaned in closer, his voice full of attentiveness. "Lisa, this is very important. Are you sure it was a BMW? Did you notice anything that we could use to identify it?" "Yes, I'm sure," Lisa nodded. "The car was at the station for a short time, but I remember its shape and the emblem. I was too scared to get closer." Caroline looked at Michael, her eyes shining with hope. This was more than they had expected. "Lisa, you did the right thing coming forward. We will look for that car and its owner. Your information might help us find those responsible for this crime," Caroline said. After Lisa left, the detectives immediately began checking all silver BMWs in the area. They knew it could take some time, but they felt they finally had a genuine lead. The next morning, detectives Caroline Drake and Michael Hunter, understanding the importance of the new lead, began working on analyzing data about silver BMWs registered in the county. One vehicle stood out clearly from the rest. It was the car belonging to Travers, a known felon with a history of assaults and thefts. This name and car became the first real lead that could potentially solve the case. "We need to check him out," Michael said, studying the details about Travers. "But if he's involved, we need to be careful. We can't afford to let him slip away." Caroline, looking concerned, reviewed the list of car owners and made notes. "What if we use Lisa as bait?" she suggested. "If Travers and his accomplices realize they're being hunted, they might start covering their tracks. But if Lisa contacts them, claiming she has information, they might want to meet her." Michael frowned, understanding the risks associated with this plan. "It's very risky. We need to be sure we can control the situation. But if done right, we might catch them in the act. After discussing the plan, the detectives called Lisa to the station and explained the strategy. Lisa, not fully grasping the risks involved, was shocked by the proposed plan. Lisa, we understand this might be frightening, Caroline said, trying to show empathy. But if you agree, we have a chance to stop these people and seek justice. We'll be with you every step of the way. Lisa appeared dejected and exhausted, her hands trembling. She knew her involvement in the operation could be dangerous but also understood that it might help catch the criminals who had ruined her life. Okay, I agree, she said, trying to overcome her fear. But only if you truly protect me. The detectives assured her of their support and prepared the operation plan. Lisa was to call the suspected criminals and arrange a meeting at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The location was chosen because it provided operatives the ability to observe the meeting from a distance and intervene if necessary. On the day of the operation, Lisa was incredibly nervous. Her hands shook as she dialed the number, and her voice betrayed her anxiety. She had to pose as a blackmailer wanting to discuss information about the kidnapping. I saw what happened at the station, she said, trying to control her voice. I have something to say, but I don't want it to be known to others. After a brief conversation and a few negotiating phrases, they agreed to meet at the warehouse. Lisa sat in a car parked near the warehouse, her heart pounding in sync with the heavy thud of anticipation. Each moment of waiting seemed like an eternity, and her thoughts were clouded with fear. When the silver BMW arrived at the warehouse, Lisa felt her blood run cold. A large man, whom she recognized as the driver from the night of the abduction, stepped out of the vehicle. He looked cautious but confident, clearly accustomed to such encounters. Is this why you wanted to talk? He asked gruffly, scanning the area as if expecting an ambush. Yes, Lisa replied, trying to stay calm. I need a guarantee of safety if I tell you what I know. The man's suspicion deepened, his gaze sliding over her face, but he was clearly interested in what she had to offer. Speak quickly, he said, continuing to look around. At that moment, Michael and the team of operatives, who had been lying in wait, received the signal. They surrounded the warehouse from several sides, ready to act. Despite her fear, Lisa tried to stay put, her nerves stretched to the limit. When the man tried to return to his car to flee, Michael and his team acted swiftly and decisively. They broke into the warehouse, and a short but intense struggle ensued. Lisa pressed herself against the wall, her breathing ragged as she fought to stay calm. Within minutes, the operation was complete. The man was subdued and arrested. Lisa, trembling from the strain and fear, stepped out of the car and met Caroline. You did it, Lisa, Caroline said, hugging her. We managed to catch them thanks to you. Now we need to deal with the rest of the criminals and unravel the full chain of crimes. Although deeply shaken by the events, Lisa felt relief knowing her involvement had helped catch a dangerous criminal. Her bravery and determination in this risky operation became a crucial part of the investigation, bringing the detectives closer to uncovering the truth about Anita's abduction and murder. After the successful conclusion of Operation Decoy and the arrest of the suspect at the warehouse, detectives Caroline Drake and Michael Hunter focused on analyzing the evidence and clarifying all details of the crime. John Travers, arrested during the operation, was brought to the station for questioning. But before starting the interrogation, it was crucial to ensure that the evidence against him was strong enough. At the station, Caroline and Michael discussed the interrogation strategy and prepared for the next stage of the investigation. We need to find out what Travers knows and who else might be involved, Michael said, reviewing the case materials. But before we start the questioning, we need to confirm his connection to the crime by finding additional evidence. Caroline nodded, her eyes showing determination. We need to gather everything that can confirm his involvement. If his criminal past matches our case, it could be a key link in the chain. Based on the vehicle description provided by Lisa and the information from the registration department, the detectives obtained a search warrant for Travers' home. That evening, still fresh from the decoy operation, they headed to the suspect's residence. Travers' house was located on the outskirts of town. In an unremarkable neighborhood, it was a small, single-story house with overgrown yard, which seemed to have been neglected for a long time. The operatives, waiting for the warrant, prepared for the search. They were ready for potential resistance, considering Travers' background. When the warrant was obtained, the detectives entered the house. Inside, it was dark and neglected, trash and old belongings covered the floor. It smelled of mold and old cigarettes. Caroline and Michael began their inspection. The first thing that caught their attention was a closet in one of the bedrooms. Inside, they found several items clearly belonging to the victim, Anita. They discovered her wallet, matching the description, and personal belongings she apparently left in the car on the night of the abduction. "This is a strong piece of evidence," Michael said, weighing the items in his hands. "This could significantly impact Travers' interrogation. We need to check for any more evidence." In another room, they found more incriminating evidence. On a table were drafts with illegible notes mentioning names and addresses related to the crime. One of the drafts had notes about the abandoned warehouse where the decoy operation took place, confirming that Travers was aware of the plans and activities of the criminals. Caroline pulled out a photograph and showed it to Michael. "Look, this is the place where we caught him. I see that he was aware of our steps. This confirms that he has connections with the criminal group." Once the search was completed, the detectives returned to the station with the collected evidence. During the interrogation, Travers was tense and aggressive. When questioned about the found items, he became more forthcoming. Under the pressure of the evidence and his connection to the crime scene, he began to confess his actions. "I didn't realize it was all so serious," he admitted, his voice trembling with fear. "We just wanted to make money. I didn't think it would go this far." Travers provided them with the names of his accomplices and explained how they planned the abduction and subsequent actions. This information was a significant step in unraveling the entire chain of crimes. The detectives realized they were on the right track. Travers' confessions and the gathered evidence became key in the investigation. They began planning the next steps to apprehend everyone involved in the crime and uncover the full truth about Anita's abduction and murder. The morning at the station began with a tense atmosphere. Detectives Caroline Drake and Michael Hunter were on high alert. The previous night had been full of activity, and the following morning promised to be just as busy. After the search of John Travers' home and his confessions, their main task was to gather enough evidence to arrest everyone involved in the crime and bring the case to a close. Travers, sitting in the interrogation room, looked defeated. His aggressive demeanor had changed, and now he appeared more like a broken man facing the consequences of his actions. Caroline and Michael made their final preparations for the interrogation, discussing possible tactics. "We need to leverage his fear and desire to lessen his fate," Caroline said, carefully studying the materials. "He needs to see that cooperation might be his only chance." The detectives entered the interrogation room, where Travers sat at the table, his face drawn. Michael began the conversation, aiming to establish psychological control. "John, we have enough evidence to charge you with the crime." Michael began, looking at Travers. "You already understand that your situation is very serious." Travers looked at Michael, his eyes full of fear. "I'm ready to talk," he said, his voice barely audible. "But I need to know I'll get something in return. It's just awful that all of this came out." Caroline, sitting across from him, leaned back in her chair and spoke in a calm but firm tone. "We're ready to hear everything you have to say. If you have information that can help us find the others, it will be taken into account." Travers nodded and sighed, choosing his words carefully. I was involved in Anita's abduction. We planned it because we needed the money. It didn't go as we thought. Mark Powell and Ron Flynn, they organized everything. I was just following their instructions." Caroline and Michael exchanged glances. Powell and Flynn were new names in the investigation, but now they were key figures. "Where can they be found?" Caroline asked, her voice firm. Travers reluctantly continued. "They're hiding in an old warehouse outside of town. That's where we stored the equipment and planned our next steps. If you go there, they'll definitely be there." The detectives took note of all the details and prepared for the next stage of the operation. They immediately set off for the indicated location, deciding to act quickly to prevent the criminals from escaping. The warehouse Travers mentioned was located in a remote area. Upon arrival, the detectives noticed several vehicles parked nearby and prepared for a possible confrontation. Concealed in the shadows, they surrounded the building, carefully observing all entrances and exits. Caroline and Michael gave their colleagues instructions to be ready for possible resistance. The operatives began the raid on the warehouse, and soon the sounds of resistance from the suspects indicated that they had realized they were discovered. Mark Powell and Ron Flynn, spotted inside, started to resist but were quickly subdued by the operatives. Powell and Flynn were arrested and brought to the station for questioning. With Travers, Powell, and Flynn together, the detectives conducted the final interrogation. Using the gathered evidence and confessions, they were able to connect the entire chain of events and establish exactly how the abduction and murder of Anita occurred. By the end of the day, Caroline and Michael felt a sense of relief. The investigation was nearing its conclusion, and they had untangled one of the most complex cases in their careers. Lisa Martin, who had voluntarily risked herself in the operation, was informed of its completion. She felt a sense of peace, knowing that her efforts had helped catch the culprits. The next step was preparing for trial and presenting evidence to confirm the guilt of Travers and his accomplices. The detective team was confident that justice would be served and that the criminals would be held accountable for their crimes. The day after the arrest of John Travers and his accomplices, detectives Caroline Drake and Michael Hunter prepared for the final stage of the interrogation. It was clear that the case of Anita's abduction and murder had entered a darker phase. The detectives knew that to achieve full clarity in this convoluted case, they needed to hear all the details from Travers himself. In the interrogation room, Travers sat at the table, his face a mask of fear and guilt. He repeated his words over and over, his voice trembling but resolute. Caroline and Michael braced themselves for the heavy revelations. "John, we want to know the whole truth," Caroline began. Her voice calm but stern. "Describe to us what happened to Anita." Travers sighed, his eyes darkened with fear and pain, as if the memories of the events were weighing heavily on him. We kidnapped her because she accidentally witnessed what we did. We couldn't let her live and potentially expose us," he said, his voice breaking and tense. "That evening, when we took her from the station, she had no idea what was in store for her." Travers paused for a moment, his hands trembling. Caroline and Michael listened intently, ready for the potentially shocking information. "We brought her to an old warehouse," Travers continued. "There, in seclusion, we raped her. We thought it was the only way to make her silent. She fought, but that only made us angrier." Caroline closed her eyes for a moment, her face reflecting the shock and deep pain from what she had heard. Michael, sitting beside her, tried to remain calm, though his emotions were turbulent inside. "Why did you decide to kill her?" Michael asked, his voice cold. Travers looked at him, as if seeking some understanding. "We realized that she could expose us," he continued. "The decision to kill her came after everything spiraled out of control. We knew that if she survived, we'd have problems. It was an act of extreme cruelty driven by our fear and desire to cover our tracks." Travers detailed the horrific specifics that could shake even the most experienced detectives. He described how they forcibly held Anita, how she suffered, and how they ultimately decided to end her life to avoid leaving witnesses. Each word from Travers conveyed a cruelty that was both shocking and horrifying. After Travers finished his testimony, Caroline and Michael exchanged glances. The horror they had just heard changed their perception of the entire situation. They knew that now they had all the necessary details to bring the case to a close and seek justice. Travers was taken back to his cell, and the detectives began preparing for the next stage, the trial. The hearings, the upcoming sentencing, and the presentation of evidence became their primary focus. The brutality of the crime required meticulous preparation to ensure that all the guilty parties received their due punishment. Despite the gravity of the situation, Caroline and Michael felt more confident. They knew their work was not only crucial for solving the crime but also for delivering justice to the victim who could no longer stand up for herself. In the weeks following Travers' shocking confessions, public interest in the case of Anita's abduction and murder intensified. The media and the public demanded justice and severe punishment for the criminals. The case became a symbol of the fight against violence and cruelty, with many following the proceedings with bated breath. The trial began in the Grand County Courthouse, which was packed with journalists, victims' families, and ordinary citizens awaiting the verdict. The courtroom was filled with a tense atmosphere, where every step and every word seemed weighty and significant. Travers and his accomplices, Mark Powell and Ron Flynn, sat in the defendants' cages. Their faces were masked with stern expressions, which only heightened the anger and outrage among the audience. Their lawyers attempted to portray them as victims of circumstances, but this only fueled the public's indignation. Detectives Caroline Drake and Michael Hunter attended the trial, ready to present evidence that would confirm the defendant's guilt. The detectives knew this case was not only a test of justice but also of their professionalism. Prosecutor Mrs. Elizabeth Clark represented the prosecution. She began her opening statement with a powerful speech, laying out all the details of the crime and emotionally describing the suffering of Anita and her family. "We are here not only to seek the truth," she said, her voice filled with determination. "We are here to ensure justice for the victim who could not stand up for herself. Anita Cobbi was brutally and inhumanely murdered, and her killers must receive the punishment they deserve." During the trial, Lisa Martin's testimony was presented again. Her account, full of fear and bravery, made a strong impression on the judges and the audience. She spoke about witnessing the abduction and how her testimony led to the arrest of Travers and his accomplices. Travers and his accomplices, sitting in the defendant's cages, showed no remorse. Travers, in particular, appeared arrogant and indifferent despite the evidence of his guilt. His demeanor only intensified the outrage and anger in the courtroom. As a plethora of evidence was presented, including the items found at Travers' home and witness testimonies, the court began deliberations. The prosecutor's words and the evidence led to an even stronger public demand for severe punishment. At the end of the hearing, the defendant's lawyers managed to secure a final opportunity for the accused to speak. Mark Powell and Ron Flynn gave their final statements, but their attempts to justify and lessen their culpability failed to impress the public. "I ask you to show at least a bit of humanity," Powell said, his voice hoarse. "We were all wrong, but it shouldn't end in death." These words only heightened the outrage, as they did not come across as sincere or remorseful. When the judge announced the conclusion of the hearings, the public exhaled, awaiting the verdict. The case of Anita Cobbi's abduction and murder had become a landmark case, illustrating the importance of holding those who break the law accountable. Everyone awaited a sentence that would stand as a symbol of justice and a warning to those who think they can escape responsibility for their crimes. The judicial proceedings in the case of Anita Cobbi's abduction and murder had reached their final stage. The courtroom was filled with numerous journalists, human rights representatives, and ordinary citizens, all gathered to witness the sentencing. Emotions were running high, and the atmosphere was tense. The judge entered the courtroom, and everyone present stood in respect. He began his opening statement, reminding everyone of the severity of the crimes committed by the defendants. The evidence presented in court confirmed their full guilt and the horrifying details of the crime. The verdict was expected but still generated widespread reaction. As the judge pronounced the verdict, the courtroom fell silent. John Travers, Mark Powell, and Ron Flynn were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentence was handed down not only due to the severity of their crimes but also considering their lack of remorse and acknowledgement of guilt. The judge's words served as a just response to the violence and inhumanity they had displayed. "Defendants," the judge said, his voice stern, "you have committed crimes that have shocked society. You took the life of an innocent person, and your actions were inhumane. The sentence takes effect immediately, and you will serve life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." In response to the verdict, Travers, Powell, and Flynn showed no remorse or emotion. Their faces remained impassive, which only fueled the anger and outrage in the courtroom. Many spectators, including Anita's family, could not hide their tears and felt that justice had finally been served, although the pain of their loss remained indelible. Immediately following the sentencing, public attention focused on the consequences of this high-profile case. The case became one of the most well-known and shocking crimes in Australian history. The media actively covered the events, discussing the details of the crime and its impact on public consciousness. The public demanded legislative changes to increase penalties for violent crimes and prevent similar tragedies in the future. The government did not ignore the issue. Shortly after the verdict, an active discussion began on the need for tougher laws concerning violent crimes. Legislative bodies started to review proposals to increase sentencing and improve protection measures for potential victims. Proposed changes included stricter penalties for criminals and enhanced protection for those facing threats. Anita's family, despite their grief, welcomed the verdict as a step toward justice. They also engaged in public actions and campaigns aimed at raising awareness about violence and protecting victims. The case of Anita Cobbi's abduction and murder became a symbol of the fight against violence and a reminder of the need for continuous improvements in justice and protection systems within society. The sentence handed down to Travers, Powell, and Flynn marked an important step toward preventing similar heinous acts and ensuring that justice prevailed despite all challenges. Soon after the sentencing, genuine protests and debates erupted in society, covered extensively in news outlets and social media. The shock from the horrific crime and the satisfaction from the just verdict became catalysts for a large-scale movement advocating for justice system reform and enhanced safety measures for women. The public demanded concrete actions from authorities to prevent such tragedies in the future. Rallies and protests took place worldwide, from major cities to small towns. They called for stricter laws regarding violent crimes, effective victim protection programs, and improved law enforcement practices. People demanded that authorities prioritize women's safety and take concrete measures to protect them. Anita Cobbi's family, despite their sorrow, did not leave public attention to chance. They received numerous offers of support, but they chose to take active steps. They established a foundation in memory of their daughter to aid victims of violence and support those who faced similar horrors. The foundation was named Anita Cobbi Foundation, Protecting the Future, with its main goal being to provide financial assistance, psychological support, and legal counseling for victims of violence. The official opening of the foundation was marked by a press conference featuring Anita's parents. They spoke about their goal of creating a space where survivors could receive necessary help and support. They emphasized the importance of ensuring safety for all women and how victims of violence could receive the help and resources needed to cope with their experiences. "We are creating this foundation not only to help those in need but also to change the societal perception of violence," said Anita's mother. "Our goal is to ensure that no other family endures what we have." The foundation quickly gained popularity and support. Fundraising events held in Anita's memory raised significant amounts of money, which went towards helping victims of violence and funding awareness programs about safety issues. Additionally, the government began seriously considering legislative reform proposals aimed at increasing penalties for violent crimes and strengthening prevention measures. New legislative initiatives were developed, including expanding witness protection programs, improving monitoring and victim assistance systems, and increasing accountability for those accused of violent crimes. Society continued to discuss the need for changes in the justice system and victim protection. Media publications and social media discussions kept the issue in the spotlight. Citizens demanded that authorities take concrete steps to protect women and combat violence. Anita's family, despite their loss, continued their work, and their foundation became a symbol of the fight for victims' rights. Anita Cobbi's story and her family's struggle for justice inspired many to take action and drew attention to issues that had long been overlooked. Thus, the case of Anita Cobbi's abduction and murder left a deep mark on society. It highlighted the need for justice system reforms and safety improvements and became a starting point for significant changes in the lives of violence victims and their families. Several months had passed since the closure of the case of Anita Cobbi's abduction and murder. The public unrest and reforms triggered by this horrific crime led to significant changes in the justice and safety fields. However, for Anita's family and those directly involved in the investigation, the story did not end with the closing of the court case. Every day that Anita's parents spent fighting for their daughter's memory and helping other victims of violence left deep scars on their hearts. Although they achieved significant changes and established a foundation that continued to help many, their personal loss remained a bitter reminder that justice could not fully heal human pain. Anita's family continued their charitable work and held events in her memory, but each new achievement could not compensate for the loss of their beloved daughter. Anita's parents often remembered her in the silence of their homes, where her absence was particularly felt. No safety measures or reforms could bring her back, and each day they faced her absence. Detectives Caroline Drake and Michael Hunter, who eventually received promotions for their work on this complex and tragic case, also could not forget what they had experienced. Although their careers continued and they reached professional heights, the personal consequences of the case left deep marks on their souls. Every detail of the crime, every piece of testimony, and every interrogation memory of the criminal's cruelty always stayed with them, reminding them that an investigation is not just work but a part of their lives. Caroline often reflected on how challenging it was to cope with such cases and the importance of finding a balance between work and personal life. Her memory was filled with images of Lisa Martin's fear and grief, facing threats and danger for the sake of truth. Caroline understood that, despite the case's conclusion, her work was far from over. She continued to fight for truth and justice but carried the weight of what had been endured. Michael, in turn, frequently pondered the fate of the criminals, their cruelty, and how it affected his worldview. He realized that even the most successful investigations could not fully address the dark aspects of human nature. His work changed his outlook on life and crime, and he understood that despite all his achievements, inner peace was elusive. During this period of their lives, Caroline and Michael began to value each moment spent with loved ones more and aimed to use their knowledge and experience to prevent such tragedies in the future. They continued working on new cases but always remembered that each case was not just another file but a human fate. This story, despite its dramatic and shocking moments, became a lesson for all involved. Although justice was served and changes became possible, the wounds left by grief and loss remained open. Anita's family, Caroline and Michael, learned to live with this burden, but neither time nor achievements could fully heal their inner pain. Anita Cobbi's story left a deep impact on their lives and on society. And although her tragic fate could not be forgotten, it became a powerful catalyst for change and a reminder that true healing requires time and humanity.